He had dismantled bombs in enemy territory, pulled hostages from burning buildings, and led men through situations most soldiers never survive. Then one bad mission took everything: his rank, his team, his name, his future. So he vanished, became no one. Mopped floors in a glass tower where billionaires made decisions that moved continents, while his 7-year-old daughter slept in a one-bedroom apartment 3 miles away, trusting that her father would be home before she woke up. Nobody looked at the janitor. Nobody ever does. That was the only reason the CEO of Sterling Defense Systems was still breathing tonight. If this story already has you hooked, you're exactly where you're supposed to be. Hit subscribe and follow this channel so you never miss what comes next. These are the stories the world forgets to tell. Drop a like and leave a comment with your city and country. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to the night everything changed. The Sterling Defense Systems building didn't sleep. At 11:47 on a Tuesday night, the 42nd floor still had lights burning behind glass walls. And somewhere up there, in a corner office that looked out over the entire city, Victoria Sterling was losing an argument she couldn't afford to lose. Down on the ground floor, Ethan Cross pushed his moppy bucket through the marble lobby with the particular unhurried rhythm of a man who had learned over 2.5 years exactly how to be invisible. The wheels squeaked. They always squeaked. He'd asked the facilities manager 3 times for a replacement bucket. He'd stopped asking after the second time the man looked straight through him. The lobby smelled like floor wax and recycled air and the faint ghost of expensive cologne left behind by men who had gone home 4 hours ago. The security desk near the entrance had one guard, Marcus, 22, who spent most of his overnight shifts watching basketball on his phone with one earbud in. Ethan liked Marcus. The kid worked hard, took his job seriously enough, and had the good sense not to bother people who were just trying to get through the night. "Cold one out there," Marcus said without looking up. "Always is this time of year?" Ethan said. That was the extent of their conversation most evenings. Ethan preferred it that way. He worked methodically, section by section, the way he'd always approached any environment that needed to be cleared, starting from the perimeter, working inward, noting what had changed since his last pass. It was habit so deeply embedded he didn't think about it anymore. The brain just did it. A chair moved 3 inches from where it had been. A stairwell door propped open that was closed yesterday. The elevator call button on the east bank glowing slightly brighter than it should. He'd noticed the elevator thing 6 days ago. He hadn't said anything yet, because noticing something and knowing what it meant were 2 different things. And Ethan Cross had spent enough of his life acting on incomplete information to know what that cost. He needed to be sure. 42 floors above him, Victoria Sterling was standing at the head of a conference table that cost more than most people's cars, facing 7 men who had all decided, in their collective wisdom, that she was the problem. "The Meridian contract renewal is in 11 days, said Gerald Holt, the board's longest-serving member, a man in his mid-60s with the particular energy of someone who had never been told no by anyone under 50. Meridian's procurement team has already raised concerns about leadership stability. If we can't demonstrate, I know what Meridian's concerns are, Gerald." Victoria kept her voice level. She'd learned early that the moment she let any heat into it, the conversation shifted from the contract to her emotional state, and then she'd lost before she'd started. "I've had 3 calls with their team this week. Then you also know that they're not comfortable with the current, with me." She said it plainly, watching his face. "Just say it. They're not comfortable with me." The silence that followed had a texture to it. Gerald shifted in his chair. 2 of the other board members suddenly found their water glasses very interesting. "Your father ran this company for 31 years, said Arthur Webb, the CFO, in the careful tone of a man who thought he was being diplomatic. He had relationships with these contractors that went back decades. "You've been CEO for 14 months. That's not a criticism, Victoria. It's simply a fact." She looked at him steadily. "Here's another fact. In the 14 months I've been running this company, we've brought in 2 new government contracts, reduced operational overhead by 11%, and cleared the Halverson liability that your department flagged as potentially catastrophic 18 months ago. I'll take those facts into my next Meridian call." She gathered her folders. The meeting was over as far as she was concerned. "Victoria," Gerald's voice had shifted into something quieter, not warmer, just more careful. "We're not your enemy. I know you're not." She paused at the door. But I also know this company is worth protecting, and I intend to protect it. Good night, gentlemen. She rode the elevator down alone. Or she almost did. The thing about Victoria Sterling that most people misread, because they looked at the tailored blazer and the measured speech and the controlled expression and decided she was cold, was that she was exhausted in a way she couldn't show anyone. 14 months of proving herself to men who'd already made up their minds. 14 months of being her father's daughter in every room she walked into, as if she hadn't also been herself for 30 years before he died. She missed him in ways that still caught her sideways sometimes. Not the grief of early loss, which was clean and consuming. This was something quieter and more stubborn. The way she still reached for the phone sometimes to call him when a deal went sideways. The way she'd inherited his office and kept his desk but moved everything on top of it, because sitting behind his things felt like wearing a coat that didn't quite fit. She pressed the lobby button and stood back. The elevator doors started to close. Wait. The voice was quiet, but it stopped her. Not because it was loud, but because of something in the quality of it. The kind of voice that doesn't expect to be ignored. The janitor from the ground floor was standing 4 feet away, mop still in hand. She'd seen him before. Not really seen him. Registered his presence the way you register furniture, which she now felt a flicker of something uncomfortable about. He was tall, lean in the way of someone who hadn't had extra weight to spare in years, with dark hair going gray at the temples and a face that had been lived in hard. He was looking at the elevator with an expression she didn't have a word for. Not alarm, something past alarm. The quiet certainty of a person who has already calculated the outcome. "Ma'am, I need you to step back from that elevator." She blinked. "Excuse me?" "Please." He was already moving, not toward her, but toward the panel housing beside the elevator door. He moved differently than she'd expected. Economical, precise, no wasted motion. Step back and stay back. "What are you—" He had the panel cover off in under 4 seconds. She didn't know much about elevator maintenance, but she knew that wasn't normal. He reached into the housing with both hands and did something she couldn't follow, and then there was a soft sound. Not loud, almost like a small relay clicking, and the elevator shuddered once and went still. Ethan Cross straightened up. He was breathing slightly harder than he had been 30 seconds ago. He looked at the disabled elevator for a moment, then looked at her. "The primary cable tension sensor on this unit was bypassed sometime in the last 48 hours, he said. "The way it was wired, the car would have dropped about 8 feet when it hit the 3rd-floor landing, enough to cause serious injury, possibly worse, depending on how you fell." Victoria stared at him. "You work nights," she said. It was a stupid thing to say. She knew it was stupid the moment it came out. "Yes, ma'am." "How did you know about the—" She stopped, looked at the panel, looked at him. "How did you know how to do that?" He met her eyes for a moment, and she had the disorienting sensation of being assessed by someone who was very good at it. "I've seen wiring like that before," he said. It wasn't really an answer, and they both knew it. "I need to call security," she said, reaching for her phone. "Yes, you do." He stepped back, giving her space, and picked up the mop handle he'd set against the wall. "You should also pull the maintenance log for this unit. Someone signed off on an inspection of this bank 3 days ago. I'd want to know who." She was already dialing. She paused. "Who are you?" "Ethan Cross," he said. "I work nights." Marcus from the security desk came over fast when she called, and 2 more guards came down from upper floors within minutes, and then there were calls being made and people moving, and in all of it, Ethan Cross stepped back and became exactly what he'd been for 2.5 years. The background. The furniture. The man nobody looked at. He finished the west section of the lobby while the security team cordoned off the elevator bank. He heard someone say, "tampered with," and someone else say, "city inspection," and a third voice saying they'd need to pull camera footage. He was counting on the camera footage. Not because he wanted to be seen, because what was on those cameras would tell him what he needed to know about how long someone had been watching this building and how patient they were willing to be. An operation like the elevator. That wasn't a rush job. That was someone who understood delayed timelines, who thought in terms of accidents rather than direct action. That level of patience meant resources. It meant planning that went back further than a few weeks. Ethan had seen that kind of planning before. He'd been on the receiving end of it, years ago, in a place he didn't let himself think about during working hours. He pushed the bucket toward the service corridor and tried to breathe through the thing tightening in the back of his chest. He was good at that. He'd had a lot of practice. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He already knew who it was before he looked. Sophie. Daddy, are you coming home tonight? He typed back. Yes, baby. By 1. Go to sleep. 3 dots appeared. Then, I'm not tired. He almost smiled. She was absolutely tired. She was always tired by 9, and she always claimed otherwise. Put on the ocean sounds, he typed. I'll check on you when I get home. A pause. Then a single emoji, a whale. Because Sophie had gone through a phase at age 5 where whales were the best animal, and it had never fully passed. He put the phone back in his pocket and stood still for a moment in the service corridor, alone, letting the tightness in his chest settle into something manageable. Someone had tried to kill the CEO tonight. They tried to make it look like an accident, and they'd done it using a method that required intimate knowledge of building systems, a security bypass that had been signed off by someone with access to maintenance records, and the kind of planning that didn't come from amateur operators. Ethan had walked away from this world. He'd been very deliberate about it. He'd built a small, contained life, a routine, an apartment, a daughter who left whale emojis in his texts. And he told himself that was enough, that it would stay enough, that whatever he'd been before could stay buried. The problem was that buried things had a way of surfacing. He looked at the corridor wall for a moment. Then he walked back to finish the lobby. The camera footage went to the head of building security at 12:20 a.m. By 12:35, it had been flagged and sent up the chain. By 1:15, a copy of it existed on a server 3 states away, routed through 2 private proxies to an office where a man sat in the dark watching a monitor. Damian Wolf was 54 years old, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of face that read as trustworthy in boardrooms and congressional hearings and charity dinners. He wore that face the way other people wore a watch. Selected, polished, useful. He watched the footage 3 times. The janitor moving to the panel. The way his hands worked. The angle of his body during the 7 seconds it took him to locate and disable the relay. Damian leaned back in his chair. He'd spent 4 years believing the man was dead. 4 years of calculated patience, building towards something that was finally within reach, and now this. He should have been angry. He recognized the shape of anger in his chest, the familiar surge of it. But underneath the anger was something else. Something that, in a different man, might have been called relief. He'd wondered sometimes in the quiet hours whether it had been too clean, whether someone like that could simply disappear. He pulled up a second screen, opened a contact list, and dialed. "We have a complication," he said when the line picked up. A pause on the other end. "How significant?" Damian looked at the frozen frame on his monitor. The janitor standing upright in the lobby, mop in hand, watching the security team work like he had all the time in the world. "Significant enough," Damian said, "but manageable." He paused. "Tell the team to hold position. I want this done carefully." He ended the call and sat in the dark for a long moment, staring at the face of the man he thought he'd already erased from the world. "Warden," he said quietly, to no one. He almost sounded pleased. Ethan Cross got home at 1:08 a.m. The apartment was on the 4th floor of a building that had a broken elevator 2/3 of the time, and a landlord who returned calls eventually. It wasn't much. It had a kitchen that fit 2 people if they stood sideways, a bathroom with a shower head that ran cold on the left side, and 2 bedrooms, one of which contained a 7-year-old girl who was absolutely, definitively not asleep. He knew this because the light was off, and it was too quiet. Sophie went silent when she was pretending. He pushed open the door. In the darkness, a small shape lay very still under a comforter with stars on it. "I can hear you thinking," he said. A pause. Then, "And that's not possible. Thinking doesn't make noise." "Your kind of thinking does." He sat on the edge of the bed. "What's going on?" Another pause, longer this time. Sophie was 7.5 and had strong opinions about most things and a very low tolerance for being managed. She'd gotten that from him, he thought, which meant he had exactly no one to blame. "Kayla at school said her dad takes her to soccer on Saturdays," Sophie said finally. "Like, he's always there." The tightness in his chest again. Different texture from before. "I know I've missed some Saturdays," he said carefully. A lot of Saturdays. Yeah. He didn't argue with it. Yeah, a lot. She rolled over and looked at him in the dark. She had her mother's eyes, dark and direct, and the kind that made it hard to look away from when she really wanted you to hear something. Are you okay? She asked, not asking about the Saturdays anymore. The question from a 7-year-old shouldn't have landed the way it did. He'd been asked that question by trained operators, by field medics, by people with a professional stake in the answer. Sophie asked it the way she asked everything, like the answer actually mattered to her personally. I'm okay, he said. She studied him for a moment with the unsettling thoroughness of a child who didn't entirely believe him, but had decided not to push it tonight. The ocean sounds didn't work, she informed him. I know. The whale sounds would have been better. I'll remember that. He pulled the comforter up around her. Go to sleep. You smell like floor cleaner. Occupational hazard. She made a small sound that was almost a laugh, and he sat there until her breathing evened out, which took about 4 minutes, because she was exhausted no matter what she claimed. Then he went to the kitchen, made coffee he didn't need, and sat at the small table with his phone. He opened his contacts, scrolled to a name he hadn't called in 11 months, Ray Kowalski, the only man from his unit who'd gotten out whole enough to build something afterward. Ethan stared at the name, the elevator, the wiring, the patience behind it. The way Damien Wolf's operation had always relied on people who understood how to make a murder look like a footnote. He knew better than to think this was coincidence. He'd operated in a world where coincidence was a story you told yourself when you weren't ready for the truth. He pressed call. It rang twice. You know what time it is? Ray's voice was rough with sleep but not surprised. That was the thing about men who'd done what they'd done. Some part of them was always waiting for the middle of the night call. I need you to pull something for me, Ethan said, quietly. A beat. Ray was awake now, fully. What happened? Not sure yet. Ethan wrapped both hands around the coffee mug. But someone tried to kill the woman I work for tonight, and the way they tried to do it. He stopped. Warden. Ray's voice had gone flat and careful. Talk to me. It's the same playbook, Ethan said. Same kind of delayed mechanism, same bypass signature. He paused. Ray, I need to know if Wolf is still operational. The silence on the other end stretched long enough that Ethan counted it. I'll make some calls, Ray said finally. His voice was different now. The sleep was gone. Something older had replaced it. Something both of them had spent years trying to set down. Give me 24 hours. 12. Another pause. 12, Ray agreed. Ethan ended the call and sat in his kitchen while the city made its quiet nighttime sounds outside the window. The coffee went cold. He didn't drink it. Down the hall, Sophie slept with the uncomplicated faith of a child who believed her father had everything handled. He hoped she was right. Ray called back in 9 hours. Ethan was on his 3rd cup of coffee by then, sitting in the break room on the building's 2nd floor with a ham sandwich he'd bought from the vending machine and hadn't touched. His shift didn't start for another 40 minutes, but he'd come in early because the apartment had felt too small that morning, the walls too close, the silence between his thoughts too loud. Sophie was at school. The neighbor 2 doors down, Mrs. Garza, a retired woman who watched Sophie on the evenings Ethan worked late, had taken her in her car at 7:30 with a lunchbox shaped like a rocket ship. He'd watched from the window until the car turned the corner. His phone buzzed on the table. Tell me, he said. Ray's voice was different from the middle-of-the-night version, tighter, more controlled, which meant he was worried. Damien Wolf. Still operational, more than operational. The man's been expanding. Black Horizon restructured itself about 3 years ago after the Congressional Oversight Review. New shell companies, new contract vehicles, new faces on the letterhead. But it's the same structure underneath. Same people? Core leadership, yeah. They brought in some new blood on the enforcement side. Private military contractors, mostly Eastern European sourcing, but the decision-making layer is intact. A pause. Ethan. They're pulling in serious federal contracts. Someone's been running interference for them at the procurement level. Ethan was quiet for a moment. He was looking at the sandwich. What about the Sterling contract? He heard Ray exhale. Sterling Defense Systems is on the short list for a $2.4 billion satellite surveillance contract. DoD renewal, due to go through in about 6 weeks. If Sterling wins that, it shuts out the competing bid. Another pause. Black Horizon is behind the competing bid, buried 3 layers deep through a holding company in Delaware, but it's them. The break room hummed with the sound of the refrigerator. Somewhere down the hall, a door opened and closed. So it's not just about her, Ethan said. It's never just about one person with Wolf, you know that. Ray's voice had the quality of a man choosing his next words carefully. The elevator. If that had worked, the contract review board would have had to delay the process. Victoria Sterling dies in what looks like an accident. The company goes into a leadership crisis. The board scrambles. The DoD gets nervous about stability. Black Horizon's competing bid starts to look like the safer option. And Wolf picks up a $2.4 billion contract. Plus he acquires whatever classified satellite technology Sterling has been developing in-house, which, based on what I can find, is substantial. Ray stopped. Ethan, there's something else. He waited. The maintenance log for the elevator bank. The inspection sign-off you were looking at, I traced the certification number. It roots back to a company that did a routine systems audit of the building 8 weeks ago. A beat. The company doesn't really exist. It's a paper entity, registered in Nevada, dormant for 6 years. Someone activated it, ran it through the building's vendor approval process using forged references, got 2 people in to do the audit. Ray's voice dropped slightly. The same entity signature shows up in 3 other incidents over the past 4 years. A gas line inspection before an explosion in Dallas. A fire safety audit before a warehouse fire in Phoenix. Both ruled accidental. Ethan's jaw tightened. They've done this before, he said. Multiple times. And they're good at it. Another pause, longer than the others. I reached out to one contact I still have on the federal side. Quietly, through channels that won't get traced back. He said there's been a low-level flag on Black Horizon for about 18 months. Someone's been building a case. But it's slow. These things are always slow. Slow doesn't help me right now. No. Ray's voice was flat. It doesn't. He let the silence sit for a moment. So what are you doing? It was a fair question, and Ethan didn't have a clean answer to it. What he was doing was sitting in a break room on the 2nd floor of a building he worked nights in, wearing a uniform that said his name on the chest in embroidered letters, eating a ham sandwich badly. What he was doing was trying to figure out how much of his small, carefully constructed life he was about to take apart. I don't know yet, he said. You do know, Ray said. You just don't like the answer. He ended the call. The sandwich went in the trash. Victoria Sterling spent the morning. She couldn't be honest about feeling scared running 2 conference calls and a department review, and she was good at it, which she found more exhausting than the fear itself. She'd slept 3 hours. The rest of the night had been security briefings, a call with the building's insurance carrier, a call with her head of security, Logan Pierce, a former federal agent with a square jaw and the careful demeanor of someone who'd spent years in rooms where he needed to project competence, and an increasingly tense conversation with Gerald Holt, who'd apparently been awake at 2 a.m. when the alert came through and had opinions about what it meant for board confidence. She didn't think about the elevator directly. She'd gotten good at that, quarantining the things that frightened her into a separate compartment she could access later, when there was time. Her father had done the same thing. She'd watched him do it her whole childhood. She used to think it made him cold. She understood now that it was just the only way to function. What she kept coming back to, in the spaces between meetings, was the janitor. The way he'd moved to the panel. The way he'd known. She asked Logan about it mid-morning, after the department review cleared out, and she had 10 minutes before the next thing. Ethan Cross, Logan said. He was standing near the window of her office in the particular at-ease posture of a man who was never fully at ease. He's been with the cleaning service for 2.5 years. No issues on record. His employment history before that? A slight pause. There's a gap. About 9 years where the record is thin. Some contract work, a few partial addresses. Nothing that flags on a standard background check. Logan's expression didn't change, but something in it shifted slightly. I can run a deeper pull. Do that. Victoria. He said her name carefully, the way he always did when he was about to say something he'd pre-organized. Last night could have been a maintenance failure. The building systems are older than Logan. She looked at him steadily. The man disabled what was in that panel in under 10 seconds. He knew exactly what he was looking for. Whatever that was, it wasn't a standard maintenance failure, and you know that as well as I do. He nodded, once, not arguing. I'll run the pull. Today. Yes. After he left, she stood at her window and looked out at the city for a moment. The view from up here had always done something for her. Not comfort exactly, more like perspective. The city didn't care what happened in this office. It went on doing what it did. That used to feel impersonal, and now it felt steadying. Her phone rang. Marcus from overnight security, which was unusual. He should have been off shift for hours. Ms. Sterling, he said when she picked up. Sorry to bother you, I wanted to say something about last night. Go ahead, Marcus. That guy, Ethan, the cleaner. She could hear him working up to something. The particular rhythm of a person choosing whether to say the thing or leave it. I've worked with him for a year and a half. He's quiet, doesn't cause problems, good at his job. But sometimes I'd catch him looking at things, the lobby layout, the camera positions, the access points, like he was memorizing all of it. I never said anything because I figured he was just careful. Some people are just careful, you know? Yes, she said. I know. Last night when he moved to that panel, I've never seen anyone move like that. It reminded me of my cousin who did 2 tours overseas. That same kind of, I don't know how to describe it, like the body knows things the brain doesn't have to think about anymore. He paused. I don't know if that means anything. It does, she said. Thank you, Marcus. Ethan found the second device on Thursday. He wasn't looking for it specifically. He was doing what he'd been doing quietly for the past week, which was extending his normal cleaning route to include areas he wasn't assigned to. The lower parking structure, the loading dock, the secondary mechanical room on the basement level, on the basis that whoever had accessed the elevator panel had needed a way in that didn't go through the main lobby cameras. The loading dock camera had a 17-second blind spot during its rotation cycle. He'd timed it on Monday. It was too consistent to be accidental. The device was attached to the underside of a junction box in the mechanical room. Small, matte black, about the size of a thumb drive. He recognized the form factor. It was a signal relay, the kind used to remotely monitor building system data. Someone was watching the mechanical room's control network from outside the building. He didn't touch it. He took 3 photos with his phone from different angles, then walked out the way he'd come in and went back to his assigned floor with his mop and bucket like nothing had happened. That evening, he sent the photos to Ray. Ray's response came back in 2 hours. Black Horizon acquisition signature, same hardware profile used in the Phoenix incident. They're mapping the building's systems remotely. Ethan, they're still active. This isn't over. He knew it wasn't over. He'd known it wasn't over since the night he'd stood in the lobby with a mop in his hand and watched Victoria Sterling step back from an elevator that would have killed her. The question that was keeping him up at 3 in the morning, the question he turned over and couldn't put down, was what he was going to do about it and what it was going to cost him. Because he knew this. The moment he stopped being invisible, the moment he did anything that put him in the frame as something other than a janitor who got lucky, the version of his life he'd built was going to start coming apart. His cover, thin as it was, real as it had become, would surface everything he'd spent years burying. And buried things had reach. They reached toward Sophie. He thought about that. Thought about it for a long time. Then he called Ray again and said, I need everything you can get me on Black Horizon's current operation structure. Specifically, anything tied to Sterling Defense. And I need it before the weekend. You've made a decision, Ray said. It wasn't a question. I don't know if I had a choice. You always have a choice. A pause. You just don't always like the options. It happened on a Friday. Ethan was on the 14th floor, running the buffer over the hallway tile, when the building's fire alarm system went silent in a way it shouldn't have. Not a normal silence. The alarm hadn't been triggered. It was the silence of a system that had been externally suppressed. He'd been in enough compromised buildings to recognize the difference between a system at rest and a system that had been put to sleep. He killed the buffer, left it where it stood, and moved to the stairwell. He heard them on the 12th floor. 3 of them coming up, moving with the particular measured pace of trained operators. Not rushing, not careless, pacing themselves for a building they'd already mapped. He pressed flat against the stairwell wall above the landing and counted footsteps and breathing and the soft sound of gear shifting. 3. Armed, coordinated, He had a mop handle. He thought about his options for approximately 2 seconds. The first man through the stairwell door got the mop handle across the throat before he cleared the frame, which took him out of the equation immediately. The second one reacted fast, better trained than the first, and got a forearm up, which meant Ethan took a glancing hit to the shoulder that torqued his arm wrong before he could get the leverage he needed to bring the man down. The shoulder screamed. He ignored it, which was a thing he'd had a lot of practice doing, and used the man's own forward momentum to pivot him into the wall hard enough to end the engagement. The third one had pulled a weapon by then. Ethan was already moving, inside the gun's effective range before the man could adjust, and what followed was brief and ugly, and not something that would have looked like much from outside. Just two men very close together in a stairwell for about 4 seconds, before the third operative was on the floor and Ethan was breathing hard against the wall with his bad shoulder screaming and blood from somewhere on his forearm patching the sleeve of his uniform. He stood there for a moment. His hands were steady, which was the thing about trained muscle memory. It didn't have feelings about what it did. That came later. He zip-tied all three with their own equipment and called building security. Then he went looking for Victoria. She was in her office on the 38th floor, alone, which was both the best and worst possible scenario. Best because no one else was in the immediate line of whatever this was. Worst because alone meant no witnesses to whatever he was about to say, and no buffer between his explanation and her judgment of it. He knocked twice and opened the door without waiting. She turned from the window. She took him in. The blood on his sleeve, the way he was holding his right shoulder, the expression on his face, which he knew from experience was not a reassuring one, and her own expression went very still. "What happened?" she said. There were 3 of them, coming up through the stairwell from 12. He moved to her desk, put his phone down, pulled up one of Ray's photos, the relay device in the mechanical room. "They've been mapping your building systems for at least 2 weeks. This is a signal relay they planted in your basement mechanical room. Same hardware profile that's been used in at least 2 other incidents involving staged accidents." She looked at the photo. She looked at him. Her voice, when she found it, was level in the way that cost her something. "You've been investigating this?" "Yes." "Since the elevator?" "Since the elevator." She was quiet for a moment. He watched her processing it, the particular stillness of a person who is very smart and hates not having had information they should have had. He understood that feeling. He'd been on the receiving end of it enough times. "You need to tell me who you are," she said finally. Not angrily, just directly. He'd been running the words in his head since Tuesday, trying to find the version that was honest without being more than she needed to know tonight, in this office, with 3 men zip-tied in a stairwell and the sound of building security now audible somewhere below them. There wasn't a clean version. "My name is Ethan Cross," he said. That part's real. 7 years ago, I commanded a Navy SEAL hostage rescue unit, 12 operators specialized in high-value extraction under hostile conditions." He stopped. The shoulder was throbbing, and he made himself not think about it. "We were sent on a mission based on intelligence that turned out to be manufactured. False target coordinates, fabricated threat assessments. We went in thinking we were pulling out 3 civilian contractors. What we found was..." He stopped again, pushed through it. "An ambush. Preset explosive devices, same delayed mechanism design as your elevator. We lost 3 men. The mission was buried, the intelligence file was classified at a level that made it untouchable, and the official record was adjusted to remove any indication that the operation had occurred." Victoria hadn't moved. "And you," she said. "My service record was expunged. My clearances were revoked. I was told, very clearly by someone with the authority to make it stick, that if I pursued any investigation into what had happened to my team, I would lose the one thing I had left." He met her eyes. "My daughter." The office was very quiet. "Who did that to you?" she asked. Outside her window, a helicopter crossed the sky, its light blinking red and white in the dark. Ethan watched it for a moment. "The same person who's trying to kill you," he said. She absorbed this. He could see her working through it, the implications, the layering of it, the way one piece connected to the next. She was fast. Faster than most people he'd briefed, and he'd briefed people whose entire job was pattern recognition. "Damien Wolf," she said. It wasn't a question. She'd already been working on it, he realized. She'd been pulling at threads since the elevator, and she'd gotten somewhere. Yes. She turned away from him briefly, toward the window, and he saw her shoulders carry something for a moment before she pulled them back. It wasn't weakness. It was the shape of someone processing information they hadn't wanted to be true. My father knew Wolf, she said. They were adversaries in the contract space for years. My father outbid him for the Meridian contract in 2019. When my father died, she stopped. Her voice had gone slightly rougher. She didn't apologize for it. When my father died and I took over, Wolf sent a very gracious letter. He would, Ethan said. He came to the funeral. A short pause. He shook my hand. The thing about Damien Wolf in Ethan's experience was that he was the kind of man who could do that. Shake your hand at a funeral he'd arranged, smile at a board meeting while the machinery he'd set in motion was already running behind the walls. He was extraordinarily good at the human performance of it, which was what made him dangerous in a way that blunt force never quite managed to be. Your satellite technology, Ethan said. The classified development your R&D division has been working on. What's the status of it? She looked at him sharply. How do you know about that? I've been reading your annual filings and your DoD contract documentation for the past week. It's publicly accessible enough to piece together the outline. He paused. I'm not asking for the specifics. I'm asking if the technology is physically here, in this building. A beat. The prototype and the core file architecture, yes. Then we have a problem larger than 3 men in a stairwell. He picked up his phone. Wolf doesn't want to just kill you and disrupt the contract process. He wants what your company built. The staged accident buys him time and chaos, but what he's actually moving toward is acquisition, either through a hostile board maneuver after your death creates a leadership vacuum, or through extraction of the technology directly. He looked at her. Those 3 men tonight weren't the main event. They were reconnaissance in force. They wanted to know where your security gaps are and how long it takes the building to respond. The sound of security on the floors below had gotten louder now. Someone was going to be at her office door in the next few minutes. What do you need from me? Victoria asked. The directness of it caught him slightly off guard. He'd expected more questions, more resistance, more of the reasonable skepticism that a sane person ought to have for a janitor who'd just told them their life was in danger from a conspiracy that had apparently been running for years. What he got instead was a woman who had already decided the available information was sufficient and wanted to know what came next. He respected that enormously, and he didn't say so, because it wasn't the moment. I need access to your building's complete security architecture, he said. Camera positions, access logs, maintenance records for the past 6 months. And I need to know who on your internal team has the clearance level to have accessed the elevator maintenance schedule. She nodded. I'll get you access. And I need you to not tell Logan Pierce we had this conversation. She went still. Logan's been my head of security for 3 years. I know. I'm not saying he's compromised. I'm saying I don't know yet, and until I do, the fewer people who know what I know, the better. He held her gaze. I'm sorry. I know that's not comfortable. No, she said. It's not. She picked up her phone from the desk. I'll handle the stairwell situation. Give me 5 minutes with Logan before you come down. He moved toward the door, stopped. Ms. Sterling. She looked up. The man who whispered in the stairwell tonight, he said. The third operative. Before things went badly for him, he said something. Ethan paused. He used a call sign, something from my operational period. He watched her face. It means someone briefed those men on who I am. They knew before they came into the building that I'd be here. That changes the timeline. It means Wolf identified me before tonight, probably within 24 hours of the elevator incident. She held his gaze steadily. What does that mean for you? He thought about Sophie, asleep in the apartment 3 miles away with her star comforter and her whale emoji, and her absolute certainty that her father had things handled. It means the clock is shorter than I thought, he said. He went down the stairs. Behind him, Victoria Sterling stood in her office for exactly 30 seconds. He counted, from habit, before he heard her voice on the phone, calm and measured, taking control of the next thing the way she took control of everything, by deciding she was going to and then doing it. The stairwell was cold and smelled like concrete. His shoulder had stiffened up badly, and his arm was crusting with dried blood, and he needed about 8 hours of sleep he wasn't going to get. He moved down toward the sound of security and voices and the particular organized chaos of a building that had just realized it wasn't as safe as it thought. The third operative had said one word in the stairwell, in the brief ugly moment before Ethan put him down. Warden. Not his name. His call sign. The designation his unit had used in the field, the one that appeared in operational files that had been classified and buried and supposedly erased from every record that existed. Someone had kept a copy, and they'd just told Damian Wolf exactly where to find him. The weekend passed in the particular grinding way of weekends when something bad is coming and you can't do anything about it yet. Ethan spent Saturday morning at Sophie's school doing a thing he almost never got to do, which was sit in a small plastic chair designed for a 7-year-old and watch his daughter present a project about ocean ecosystems to her class. The project involved a poster with hand-drawn fish, several facts about blue whales that she'd made him quiz her on for 3 consecutive evenings, and a level of conviction in her delivery that he found genuinely moving in a way he couldn't have explained to anyone. He sat in that plastic chair with his shoulder taped under his uniform shirt and his mind running 2 parallel tracks, one watching Sophie point at her whale drawing with a ruler, the other cataloging the exits in the classroom and the sight lines from the 2 windows that faced the parking lot. And he hated the second track, hated that he couldn't turn it off. But he also knew that the second track was the reason Sophie still had a father to sit in the plastic chair. Afterward, she made him stop for ice cream even though it was 52 degrees outside. "It's not ice cream weather," he told her. "Ice cream doesn't have weather," she said, with the particular authority of someone who had considered this question seriously and arrived at a conclusion. He bought her ice cream. He got coffee. They sat at an outside table because she wanted to, and he watched her eat mint chocolate chip with the single-minded focus of a small person who had identified the best thing in her immediate vicinity and intended to fully commit to it. "Your project was good," he said. "I know." She didn't say it with arrogance. She said it the way someone says a thing they've worked hard enough on to be confident about. The part about echolocation was the best part. Miss Reyes said so. Miss Reyes was right. Sophie looked at him over her ice cream cone with the dark, direct eyes that had always seen more than he was comfortable with. "You look tired," she said. "I'm fine." "You say that a lot." "Because it's usually true." She considered this with the expression she made when she wasn't sure whether to push something. Then she went back to her ice cream, and he sat across from her in the cold and let the moment be what it was, because there weren't going to be unlimited versions of this moment, and he'd learned to notice the ones he had. That evening, after Mrs. Garza had come to stay with Sophie, he drove back to the building and spent 3 hours in the security office with a hard drive Ray had couriered to him, running access log analysis on the building's internal systems. He was looking for a pattern, the specific shape of someone who had legitimate access and had used it at the wrong times or in the wrong sequence, which was always how inside access looked if you knew what to look for. He found it at 11:40 p.m., the access to the elevator maintenance schedule, the system that would have shown the inspection sign-off, the one that had been used to cover the wiring job, had been pulled from an internal terminal. The terminal was assigned to the facilities management department, but the login credentials that had pulled it belonged to a user account that, according to the HR system Ray had helped him cross-reference, was a mid-level IT administrator named Craig Fenn, who had no professional reason to be in the facilities management system at 2:30 in the morning on a Tuesday. Craig Fenn, who had been with the company for 14 months, who had joined 2 months after Victoria Sterling took over as CEO, whose employment references, when Ethan ran them through Ray's contacts the following morning, turned out to be as real as the Nevada shell company that had done the building inspection, which was to say, structured carefully enough to survive a standard check and hollow underneath. He was a plant. Had been one from the beginning. Ethan sat with this information for a long time before he decided what to do with it, because the obvious move, take it to Logan Pierce, was the move he'd already told Victoria he wasn't ready to make. Not because he thought Logan was dirty, but because he'd learned expensively that the obvious move in a situation engineered by someone like Damian Wolf was almost always the move Wolf wanted you to make. He called Victoria instead. It was past midnight. She picked up on the second ring, which told him she hadn't been sleeping either. "Craig Fenn," he said. A short silence. "My IT administrator. He's not yours. He was placed before you fully took over leadership. His references are fabricated. He accessed the facility's management system the night before the elevator inspection sign-off was logged. He paused. He's been inside your systems for over a year. He heard her breathe out slowly. Not panic, something more controlled than panic and harder to sustain. What has he had access to? Potentially everything below the top security clearance tier. Network architecture, contract documentation, personnel files, internal communications. He stopped. Victoria, if he's been feeding information to Wolf for 14 months, then Wolf knows your company from the inside out. The DoD contract file, the satellite project status, the board's private deliberations, all of it. Another silence. He could hear her thinking through it, the shape of the problem expanding outward in her mind the way it had in his. What do we do about him? She asked. Nothing yet. The moment he knows we've identified him, whatever access he has gets burned and Wolf adjusts. Right now, he's more useful to us in place. He leaned back in the security office chair. But you need to know who else might have been recruited. He can't have been operating alone in there. One IT administrator doesn't give you everything Wolf would need. You're saying there could be more. I'm saying act as if there are, until we know otherwise. She was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice had changed slightly. Not softer exactly, but more honest. Less CEO, more person. I keep thinking about the fact that Wolf came to my father's funeral, that he looked me in the face. He's good at looking people in the face. How does someone get like that? It was a real question, not rhetorical, and he thought about it seriously before he answered. I think they start by deciding that other people are primarily useful, and then they just get better at it over time. That's a bleak answer. It's a bleak question. She made a small sound that, in a different context, might have been a laugh. Go get some sleep, she said. You sound like someone who's been awake for too long. So do you. Occupational hazard, she said, and he recognized his own phrase from weeks ago coming back to him. And despite everything, despite the shoulder and the access logs and the thing tightening in his chest that had been there since Ray's first phone call, he almost smiled. He went home. He didn't sleep much. The leak happened on a Wednesday. Ethan found out the way everyone else did, through the building's internal alert system, which pinged all department heads and senior security personnel at 6:47 a.m. with a one-line message: confidential contract documentation has been identified in external circulation. All relevant personnel report to the 8th floor conference room immediately. He was in the parking structure when the alert came through. He read it twice, then pulled up Ray's number. It's already moving, Ray said when he picked up. He'd clearly been awake. Someone pushed a selective package of Sterling's DoD proposal documentation to 2 defense industry news aggregators overnight. It's going to be public by 8 a.m. What's in it? The bid pricing on the satellite contract and, this is the bad part, internal memos discussing technical limitations of the prototype, things that would give a competing bid a significant advantage in the evaluation process. Ethan was walking toward the building entrance. Fen. Almost certainly, but the timing is the thing to pay attention to. This didn't come out of nowhere. This is a move designed to hit before the board meeting. A pause. Ethan, the Sterling board has an emergency session at noon today. This documentation going public puts Victoria in a very bad position with the contract review committee. He pushed through the lobby door. Marcus was at the desk, looking tense and young. Morning, Ethan said, not stopping. Something's going on, Marcus said, which was an understatement on the level of noting that the weather seemed damp during a flood. He took the stairs to the 8th floor. The conference room was already loud. 6 of the senior staff talking over each other with the particular energy of people who were scared and expressing it as anger. Logan Pierce stood near the front, arms folded, watching the room with the controlled expression of a man who was processing something he didn't fully understand yet. Victoria was at the head of the table. She looked like she'd been awake for hours, which she probably had, and she'd done whatever she'd done to pull herself together for this room. But Ethan could see the fatigue around her eyes, and the slight tension at the corners of her jaw that meant she was working harder than she was letting on. She caught his eye across the room for one brief moment, barely a second, and then looked back to the group. He stood near the door and listened. The Contract Review Committee chair is already called, said Arthur Webb, the CFO, whose composure had slipped considerably since the last time Ethan had seen him. If Sterling's internal pricing and technical assessments are in public circulation before the evaluation closes, The committee is going to have serious questions about our security practices. That's before we get to the substantive content of the memos themselves. Which says what? Asked one of the other senior staff. The head of legal, a woman named Carla Voss, who had the focused energy of someone who already knew the answer was bad and wanted it confirmed so she could start working on it. The memos discuss 3 specific technical challenges with the prototype's integration architecture, Victoria said. Her voice was measured and flat. In context, they're normal development challenges that the engineering team had already identified solutions for. Out of context, they read as significant weaknesses in the system's viability, which is exactly how they'll be reported, Carla said. Yes. And the competing bid, Black Horizon's competing bid, 3 layers removed through a Delaware holding company, is going to look significantly more attractive to the review committee this afternoon than it did yesterday morning, Victoria said. I know. I've already worked that part out. The room absorbed this. Logan Pierce spoke for the first time. We need to identify the source of the leak before we can start managing the narrative. I want access to the internal communication logs from the past 72 hours. That's already in process, Victoria said. She glanced briefly at Ethan, then back to the room. We'll have preliminary results before noon. Ethan knew she meant Ray's pull, not the building's own IT security team, because the building's own IT security team included Craig Fenn, and asking Craig Fenn's department to investigate a leak that Craig Fenn had executed was a particular kind of problem. He left the conference room before the meeting was over and went to find the man himself. Craig Fenn worked in an open-plan office on the 6th floor with 4 other IT staff members who arrived, on a normal day, between 8 and 8:30. At 7:20 a.m., the 6th floor was mostly empty. Fenn was at his workstation already, which told Ethan something about his state of mind. People who had just executed a high-risk operation either ran or they overcorrected into normalcy. Fenn had chosen normalcy. He was drinking coffee and staring at his monitor with the careful blankness of a person performing calm. Ethan walked past the workstation, not stopping, and glanced at the monitor angle and the coffee cup and the position of Fenn's hands. Then he kept walking to the supply room at the end of the floor, opened it, counted to 20, and came back out. On his way back past the workstation, he dropped a cleaning rag beside the desk and crouched to pick it up, which put him eye level with the underside of the desk for 2 seconds. The secondary device under the desk, a small wireless transmitter, the same family as the relay in the basement mechanical room, was roughly the size of a matchbox. He picked up the rag and kept moving. Fenn was transmitting in real time. Whatever he was accessing on that monitor was going somewhere outside the building, which meant Wolf was watching the building's internal response to the leak as it happened, tracking how fast they identified the source, adjusting his next move based on what he saw. Ethan went back to the stairwell and called Ray. The IT plan is hot, he said. Active transmitter. He's feeding Wolf live data on their internal response. Pull him? Ray asked. Not yet. He was thinking. If Wolf loses his eyes inside the building right now, he accelerates whatever's next. I need to know what's next before that happens. He paused. Can you push him false data? Something that reads as real but buys us a window? A long pause on Ray's end. That's a technically complicated ask. Can you do it? Give me 4 hours. The board meeting at noon was brutal in the way of things that have been carefully designed to be brutal. Gerald Holt had clearly been on the phone all morning. He sat at the head of the table with 2 other board members flanking him like he'd arranged it in advance, which he probably had, and he let Arthur Webb open with the financial and reputational exposure before he said anything himself. The Contract Review Committee has formally requested a security audit of Sterling's information management practices, Webb said. Until that audit is complete, the DoD has suspended the evaluation process. The $2.4 billion contract is, as of this morning, in formal hold status. The silence in the room had weight. Additionally, said Gerald, in the voice of someone delivering a conclusion they'd reached before the meeting started, 2 institutional shareholders have reached out to my office this morning with concerns about leadership continuity. Given the sequence of events over the past several weeks, the incident with the building systems, the stairwell situation on Friday, and now this, they feel that the company's security posture reflects a management issue. Victoria was sitting across from him. Her face was controlled in the way that was costing her, Ethan knew, more than the room could see. What are you suggesting, Gerald? She asked. I'm not suggesting anything. I'm relaying what I've been told. He paused. There is some feeling that a temporary transition of operational leadership, while the security situation is assessed, would provide the stability that our contract partners and shareholders need to see. A temporary transition, Victoria said. Flat. It would be interim in nature. You're asking me to step down. We're exploring Gerald. Her voice hadn't risen. It was very steady, and Ethan standing near the back wall where he had no business being, except that Victoria had asked him to be there, and Logan Pierce hadn't questioned it because Logan Pierce was being careful around Ethan in ways that suggested he was running his own calculations. Watched her find the level beneath the anger and speak from it. I will not step aside from this company while the people who are attacking it are still operating. My father built this. I have spent 14 months defending it from people who think my age or my gender or my number of years in this chair makes me the weakest point in this structure. I am not the weakest point. I am the only person in this room who knows the full scope of what we're dealing with. And if you move to replace me right now, you will hand Damian Wolf exactly what he's been engineering for. The name landed in the room. Gerald's expression shifted. What did you say? Damian Wolf. Black Horizon. The competing bid 3 shell companies removed. She looked at him steadily. The leak that went public this morning came from inside this building, from a source that was placed here over a year ago. The elevator incident, the stairwell operatives, the signal relays in our mechanical systems. This is a coordinated campaign to destabilize this company, kill its leadership, and position Black Horizon to acquire both the DoD contract and our satellite technology. She paused. I can prove every component of what I just said, given 72 hours. What I cannot do is prove it if you remove me from this building and this process today. Another silence, longer than the first. Gerald looked at her. Then he looked at the other board members. Then he looked, briefly and with something complicated in his expression, at the man in the janitor's uniform standing near the back wall. 72 hours, he said finally. But Victoria, this needs to be resolved, and it needs to be documented. It will be. The meeting ended. People filed out. Carla Voss lingered, catching Victoria's eye with an expression that said, I believe you and I'm scared, which was an honest combination. Logan Pierce was the last to leave besides Ethan. At the door, he stopped and looked back at Victoria. Then he looked at Ethan. The look lasted about 3 seconds and contained a question he didn't ask out loud. After the door closed, Victoria sat in the empty conference room and did not speak for about 45 seconds. Ethan counted them. He didn't fill the silence, because it wasn't his silence to fill. Wolf's going to move faster now, she said finally. Yes. Because the board didn't remove me. He needed the leadership vacuum. He didn't get it. He moved away from the wall. Which means his next option is the direct one. She looked up at him. He's going to try to kill me again. He's going to try to destroy everything. You, the evidence, the satellite prototype, the documentation trail. All of it, in one move. He sat down across from her. The first time he'd sat at a table with her instead of standing near a wall. It felt strange. Appropriate and strange. When he does that, he's going to need the building. You think he'll come here? I think whatever's next happens here. This building has the evidence, the technology, and the target in one location. Wolf doesn't do anything small when he can do everything at once. He met her eyes. I need to tell you something else. She waited. Logan Pierce isn't dirty. She studied him. You said you weren't sure. I wasn't. I am now. He'd been watching Logan for a week the way he used to watch unfamiliar environments. Not for the dramatic tells, but for the small, cumulative ones. The direction a person's eyes moved when they were processing versus performing. The weight they put on certain words. The things they noticed first when they walked into a room. He's clean, but he's being set up to look dirty. The access log that identifies Craig Fenn also contains a secondary trail. Someone ran queries using Logan's credentials through an administrative backdoor. When this surfaces publicly, the evidence is going to point at him. Wolf's going to frame Logan, and then frame me for whatever happens next. 2 men with muddied backgrounds and access to building security. One of them a disgraced SEAL who's been living under a false identity. He paused. That's the story he'll tell. The data leak, the stairwell incident, the sabotage, all of it attributed to Ethan Cross and Logan Pierce, acting on behalf of parties unknown. Victoria Sterling dies in what looks like a security failure. Wolf's people step in during the chaos. The board, already rattled, accepts the stabilizing offer. She was quiet for a long moment. "He's been building this for how long?" she asked. "I think Wolf started planning this the day your father died. Maybe before." He leaned forward slightly. "The mission that destroyed my unit, it wasn't random. My team was specifically selected because we were the unit most likely to be assigned to a future contract involving Sterling's satellite technology. We had the clearance profile and the operational experience. Removing us removed a potential obstacle to Black Horizon getting access to that program." He stopped. The words had a physical quality when he said them out loud. He'd known this for days, but saying it to another person made it real in a different way. "He killed 3 of my men to protect a business plan." Victoria's face had gone very still. "I'm sorry," she said. She said it simply, without reaching for anything larger, which was exactly right. "Marcus." The name came from the doorway. Both of them turned. Marcus, the overnight security guard, was standing in the conference room doorway in his civilian clothes. He'd clearly come in on his day off, and he looked young and uncertain and determined in the way of people who have decided to do something before they've fully worked out if it was wise. "Sorry," he said. "I knocked. No one answered. He stopped, looked at Ethan. "I heard some of what you were saying. I wasn't trying to listen. I came in because I need to tell someone something, and I don't know who to trust, and you—" He looked at Ethan directly. "Are the only person in this building that I do trust right now, which is weird because you mop floors and I don't know who you actually are. But you were right about the elevator and you were right about Friday, so—" Ethan gestured to a chair. Marcus sat. He had his phone in his hand. "Last night, I was going through the external camera footage from the past 2 weeks on my own time, looking for the thing you told me about, the 17-second blind spot in the loading dock camera." He set the phone on the table, turned it to face them. "I found this." The footage was time-stamped 11 days ago. Loading dock, during the blind spot, and then the camera caught the tail end of what it had missed. 2 men moving away from the dock entrance. One of them was Craig Fenn. The other was someone Ethan didn't recognize, and he was carrying a case of the type used for technical equipment. "I ran the second man's face through the building's visitor log," Marcus said. "He's not in it. He was never in this building officially." He paused. "But I found him on the outer lobby camera from 3 days before that, just standing on the sidewalk, looking up at the building." He swiped to the next image. "I ran a reverse image search using a subscription service my cousin uses for his job. It flagged a partial match to a contract personnel record from a defense security firm." He pointed to the name at the bottom of the screen. "He works for Black Horizon." The conference room was very quiet. Ethan looked at Marcus for a moment. The kid was 22, working overnight security, and had spent his days off doing what the building's entire security department had failed to do. "You did good," Ethan said. Marcus let out a breath. "Is this as bad as I think it is?" "It's manageable," Victoria said. She sounded more certain than she had 20 minutes ago, which Ethan noticed. "What do I do?" Marcus asked. "Go home," Ethan said. "Send me everything you pulled, the footage, the image match, the timestamps. Then go home, stay off your work phone, and don't discuss this with anyone in the building until I tell you it's safe." He met the young man's eyes. "I know that's a lot to ask." "Is it going to be okay?" Marcus asked. He directed the question at Ethan in the way that people sometimes directed questions at the person in the room who seemed most likely to have been somewhere worse than here and survived it. Ethan thought about the honest answer versus the useful answer and decided, for once, they were close enough to the same thing. "I don't know," he said, "but we're working on it." After Marcus left, he and Victoria sat in the quiet room for a moment. "You should have told me to tell him yes," she said. "He's 22 and he's already done more than he should have to. He deserves an honest answer." She looked at him. Something in her expression had shifted. Not softened exactly, more like recalibrated. The way you look at something you thought you understood and realized you'd been measuring it slightly wrong. "How long has it been?" she asked. "Since you've done this. Really done it, not just reacted." He knew what she meant. She meant planned, moved pieces, operated. 7 years. "Does it come back?" He thought about the stairwell. about the way his hands had moved before his brain had consciously decided anything, about the calm that had settled over him in the worst moment, the same calm that had once made his commanding officer describe him as the most unsettling person he'd ever put in a field. "It never really leaves," he said. Then his phone buzzed on the table. Ray. He picked it up. Ray said 4 words. "The espionage charge is filed." Ethan went still. Victoria was watching his face. "What is it?" He set the phone down. Outside the conference room window, he could see 2 men he didn't recognize crossing the lobby floor below, moving with purpose, in suits that didn't quite fit the way company people's suits fit, with the particular energy of law enforcement who had decided they already knew the answer and were here to confirm it. "They're arresting me," he said. Not angry, not surprised. He'd known this was a possible move. He just hadn't known Wolf would make it today. Victoria was already standing. For what? Espionage. Corporate espionage, probably. Someone filed a complaint linking me to the leak this morning. He stood. He straightened his uniform shirt, which was a useless gesture, and he did it anyway. "The log trail that points at Logan Pierce also points at me. Wolf needed to neutralize us both, and this is faster than killing us." He looked at her. "Don't resist this. Don't make it dramatic. Let them take me. It buys you time while Wolf thinks his board play is still viable." "Ethan, Victoria." He said her name for the first time, and it stopped her. "While I'm out of the building, you need to move the satellite prototype. Physically move it to a secure off-site location that only you and your most trusted engineering lead know about, tonight, before Wolf escalates." He held her gaze. "Don't tell Logan until it's done. Don't tell anyone until it's done." She stared at him. "You're asking me to trust you from a holding cell. I'm asking you to trust 7 years of watching a man like Wolf operate and knowing exactly what he does when the board play fails." He heard the elevator opening in the lobby below, the sound of shoes on marble. "The board play is going to fail, which means he's going to burn the building down." The conference room door opened. 2 men in suits and a building security officer who looked deeply uncomfortable. One of the suited men had the careful face of a federal contractor, someone used to doing someone else's unpleasant work. "Ethan Cross," the man said. "Yeah," Ethan said. He went with them without making it difficult. In the lobby, with his hands cuffed in front of him, a small mercy, front not back, he passed Marcus's empty security desk and the elevator bank where it had started, and the clean marble floor he had pushed a mop across for 2.5 years. He walked out through the glass doors into the cold afternoon and did not look back, because looking back wasn't going to help anyone. In the conference room on the 8th floor, Victoria Sterling stood at the window and watched the car pull away. Then she picked up her phone and called her senior engineering lead. "I need to meet with you tonight," she said. "Off-site. Bring the portable backup array for the prototype file architecture." A pause. "Tell no one. Use the side entrance." She ended the call. Her hands were steady. She was terrified and her hands were steady, and she thought, not for the first time, that she was more like her father than she had always wanted to be, and that maybe, finally, that wasn't the painful thing it used to feel like. She looked at the window for one more moment, at the space where the car had been. Then she got to work. They held him in a federal contractor facility 20 minutes from the building, not a police precinct, which told him something about who had filed the complaint and what level of access they had. The room was clean and deliberately featureless, the kind of space designed to make a person feel like they existed outside normal process, outside the ordinary protections that came with a zip code and a phone call and a lawyer who showed up when you asked for one. They took his phone at intake. That was the thing he minded most. The interrogating officer was a man named Carver, mid-40s, with the particular energy of someone who had been told what conclusion to reach before he walked into the room and was now working backward to support it. He had a file folder, which he opened and closed several times in the first 10 minutes without reading from it, which was a technique Ethan recognized and found mildly insulting. "You've been employed at Sterling Defense Systems for 2 years and 7 months, Carver said. 2.5 years, Ethan said. "Yes. Prior to that, your employment history is thin. I've had some gaps." "Some gaps." Carver looked at the folder. "Your federal service record shows a discharge. Circumstances listed as administrative. No further detail available at my clearance level." Then you probably shouldn't speculate about it. Carver looked up. He had the flat eyes of a man who had decided not to be interested in the person across from him, which was its own kind of tell. Mr. Cross, the complaint filed against you this morning includes access log data, a communication trail, and testimony from 2 Sterling employees placing you in restricted areas of the building during off hours. He paused. The evidence is fairly specific. The evidence was constructed by the same people who are trying to destroy Sterling defense systems, Ethan said. And you already know that, which makes me wonder who filed the complaint on your end and who they report to. A short silence. Carver's expression didn't change, but something behind it shifted. You're not going to make this easier on yourself by... I'm not trying to make anything easier on myself. I'm telling you that every hour I sit in this room is an hour that the people who built that evidence package have to finish what they started. He leaned forward slightly. You want to do something useful, Carver? Pull the financial disclosure records for Black Horizon's Delaware subsidiaries from the past 18 months and put them next to the timeline of incidents at that building. Do that before the end of tonight. That's what I'd do. Carver closed the folder. He looked at Ethan for a long moment in the way of someone who is not quite sure what they're sitting across from. Then he stood and left the room without answering. They left Ethan alone for 4 hours. He used the time to think, which was the only tool they hadn't taken from him. He went through everything sequentially: the relay device, the access logs, Ben, Marcus's footage, the board meeting, the moment Victoria had said Damian Wolf's name out loud in a room full of people who hadn't expected to hear it. He thought about the satellite prototype and whether she'd moved it in time. He thought about Sophie, who was at Mrs. Garza's by now, doing homework at the kitchen table and probably negotiating for a second snack. He thought about the bomb design, the elevator mechanism, the relay signature in the basement, the same delayed detonation architecture that had been used in the ambush 7 years ago, the one that had killed Danny Reese and Tomas Varga and Cal Hutchins in a building, in a place Ethan wasn't going to name even in his own head, because naming it made the grief specific, and specific grief was a weight he couldn't carry tonight. Wolf hadn't just used a similar method, he'd used the same method, which meant either he was lazy, which Ethan doubted, or he was deliberate, which was the part that sat wrong in his chest like a stone that hadn't moved in years. Deliberate meant it was a message. Deliberate meant that somewhere in Wolf's calculation was the knowledge that Ethan would recognize it, and the desire to make sure he did. He wanted him to feel it again. Wanted him standing in front of another bomb that looked exactly like the last one, carrying the same failure. Ethan sat with that knowledge and breathed through it, and did not let it become anything larger than a fact he needed to account for. Ray got him out at 11:40 p.m. He didn't know exactly what Ray had done, and Ray, when he appeared in the hallway outside the holding room, did not offer to explain it. What he offered instead was Ethan's phone, returned in a sealed bag, and a dark sedan idling at the facility's side exit. You have about 6 hours before someone notices the paperwork irregularity, Ray said. He looked older than he had the last time Ethan had seen him in person, which had been 3 years ago at a diner outside of Columbus. Grayer. More deliberate in how he moved. Don't waste them. The building, Ethan said. He was already turning the phone on. I know. Ray handed him a keycard. Parking structure, level B2. I left some things in a gray bag behind the driver's side rear wheel of a blue Civic, Spot 14. Don't ask where they came from. A number he didn't recognize, and one text from Victoria sent 2 hours ago. Prototype is moved. You were right about tonight. Something's wrong with the building systems. Logan is trying to reach me. I can't raise 3 floors on the internal comm. Ethan, I think they're already here. The timestamp was 9:52 p.m. It was now 11:47. He ran to the car. He called Victoria while he drove and got nothing. Not voicemail, not a ring, just dead air, which meant either her phone was off or the building's signal was being jammed, and neither option was good. He tried Logan's direct line next and got the same result. He tried Marcus and got 2 rings before it cut to voicemail. Marcus, if you get this, stay out of the building. Do not go in. Call 911 and give them the address and say there are people inside with weapons. Do not try to help. Stay out. He ended the call and drove. Ray's gray bag contained 2 things: a tactical flashlight and a short-range radio scanner with 3 frequency presets already programmed. He picked up active signal traffic on the second preset before he'd even reached the building's block. Encrypted, compressed, the kind of burst transmission pattern used by coordinated teams who needed to communicate without creating an obvious radio signature. He counted the transmissions, timed the intervals, estimated the team size. 8 people minimum, probably 10. He parked 2 blocks out and went the rest of the way on foot. The building's exterior was dark in the places it shouldn't have been. 2 of the 3 ground floor emergency exit signs were out, which was either a power issue or someone who knew which lights to kill first. The loading dock camera was running. He could see the indicator light, but the angle had been adjusted. The lens rotated slightly upward, so the blind spot was now significantly larger than the 17 seconds Marcus had documented. Someone had physically moved the camera. That took about 40 seconds and required knowing which housing screws were accessible from outside, which meant either Fenn had passed them a facilities schematic or someone had done an on-site assessment that Ethan hadn't caught. He went in through the mechanical room entrance in the basement, using the access code Victoria had given him 3 weeks ago. The code still worked, which told him Wolf's team hadn't disabled all the access systems. They were keeping the building nominally functional because a building in full lockdown would trigger external alerts from the monitoring company. Smart. Careful. The way Wolf always ran things. The basement was dark and smelled like concrete and machine oil, and something underneath those smells that took him 2 steps to identify. The faint chemical sharpness of a gas he knew and didn't want to know. He turned on the tactical flashlight, low setting, and crouched beside the nearest ventilation access panel. They'd hit the HVAC. He pulled the panel cover and shone the light inside the duct. The delivery mechanism was a canister assembly, compact, professionally installed, the kind of unit that could be purchased through legitimate industrial channels and didn't require a specialized supply chain to acquire. This one was the same generation as units he'd seen used in 2 theater operations for area denial. Non-lethal at low concentration, incapacitating at medium. At high concentration in a sealed building over several hours, the math got worse. He pulled out the canister assembly. It came free cleanly, the attachment points hadn't been welded, they'd used removable clips, which meant either they intended to recover the hardware or they'd installed it in a hurry and set it on the floor. Then he kept moving. He found 4 more on his way up through the building, each one in a different ventilation access, each covering a different floor cluster. The top half of the building, floors 20 through 42, was the target zone. Victoria's office was on 38. The server room that housed the Satellite Technologies file architecture was on 31. He disabled all 4 he found and kept a running count of floors he'd cleared, because there were almost certainly more that he hadn't reached. On the 6th floor, he nearly walked into one of Wolf's team. The man was stationed at the stairwell junction, facing away, and Ethan pressed flat against the wall before the man's peripheral vision could catch the flashlight. He killed the light, waited 10 seconds, then moved close enough to hear the man's radio. A small earpiece, almost invisible, the kind used by high-end private security. 7 is clear, the man said quietly. Moving to 8. Copy, said a voice in the earpiece, compressed and flat. Pierce is contained on 4. Target is still on 32. Target. Victoria was on 32. Pierce is contained meant Logan was already neutralized, which meant Ethan was working alone in a building with 10 armed professionals who had his position documented, his background profiled, and a significant tactical advantage in terms of numbers and preparation. He thought about this for approximately 1 second. Then he followed the man toward 8. He took 2 of them on the 8th floor, where he'd stood in the conference room with Victoria 2 days ago. He used the conference room itself. He knew the layout, knew the door positions, knew the table was heavy enough to be useful if he needed to put something between himself and someone moving fast. He got the first man through the door before he could react, and the second one, who was better, faster, came in low instead of straight, got a hit in on his bad shoulder before Ethan put him down, and the shoulder rewarded this by making itself impossible to ignore for about 30 seconds. He sat against the conference room wall for those 30 seconds, and breathed through it and took inventory of what he had, which was a radio now, a flashlight, and a building he knew better than the people currently occupying it. The radio traffic told him the team was concentrating on the upper floors, specifically 31 through 38, the cluster that contained the server room and Victoria's office. They hadn't found the missing canister assemblies yet, which meant they were running on a timeline and hadn't built in a verification loop. That was a gap. Small, but usable. He took the service elevator to 20, the only elevator still running, which told him they needed vertical movement and had kept one car active for their own use, which also meant they were using it in rotation and he had a window between transits. He reached 20 and went up the rest of the way on foot. He found Victoria on 32. She was in a small IT support office off the main corridor, the door locked from inside, which was either her initiative or someone else's. He knocked twice, paused, knocked once. The way he'd told her in the conference room 2 days ago on the basis of an instinct he was grateful he'd acted on. The door opened 4 inches. One eye, dark and direct, looked at him through the gap. She opened it the rest of the way. The office was small and fluorescent lit and smelled like burned coffee from a machine that had been on too long. There were 2 other people in it, a woman in her 30s whom Ethan recognized as a senior member of the engineering team, and Marcus, who was sitting in the corner with his phone in his hands, looking like someone who had absolutely not taken Ethan's advice about staying out of the building. "I told you to stay out," Ethan said. "I know," Marcus said, "but I saw a man moving equipment through the parking structure when I drove past and I called it in to 911 and then He stopped. "I came in through the side entrance. I found Ms. Sterling on the stairs." "Are you armed?" "No." "Good. Stay between those 2 women and the door and don't try to do anything tactical." Ethan looked at Victoria. "Logan. They have him on 4. He was responding to a false alarm when they got him. They used a system trigger to pull him to the east wing and lock the corridor. He's not hurt. I talked to him through the building comm on 3 before it went down." She paused. "How bad is it?" 8 to 10 operators. HVAC was rigged. I disabled 5 canisters, but there are probably more. They're concentrating on this floor cluster." He looked at the engineering woman. "The satellite prototype files, you moved the hardware?" The woman, Chen, her badge said, though he'd never spoken to her before, nodded. "Off-site. Encrypted backup only remained in the server room." She paused. "Someone has been running a decryption attempt on the backup from the server room terminal for the past hour. I've been watching it remotely on my tablet. They haven't broken the second layer yet, but they will if they run it long enough." "How long?" "At the rate they're going, maybe 40 minutes. Ethan did the math. "We need to get to the server room before that." "That's on 31, Victoria said. "I know where it is." "There are people between here and there." "I know that too." She looked at him for a moment in the way she'd been looking at him more frequently, not with the assessment of someone who didn't trust him, but with the particular attention of someone who was trusting him more than they were comfortable with and was being honest about the discomfort. "What's the plan?" He laid it out. It wasn't elegant. Elegant required more assets and more time in a building that wasn't currently occupied by a private military team, but it was workable if everyone did exactly what he said and nobody tried to improve on it in real time. Victoria, Chen, and Marcus would move together, using the secondary stairwell on the west side that the team had apparently not yet covered based on the radio traffic he'd monitored. He would go ahead of them, take the east route, and clear the corridor junction outside the server room before they arrived. "If I'm not at that junction in 10 minutes, he said, you abort. You go back up, not down. You find the highest floor you can access and you barricade and you wait for external response." "About 10 minutes, Victoria said. "Don't be early and don't be late." He left the office and went east. Whoa. The corridor junction outside the server room on 31 had 2 of Wolf's people covering it, one at each end, positioned so they covered each other, which was professionally done and meant he couldn't take them sequentially without the second one reacting. He spent 90 seconds in a supply alcove working out the geometry of it, and what he concluded was that the geometry didn't favor him and he was going to have to do something uncomfortable. He used the radio he'd taken, the team's frequency. He transmitted a single burst in the compressed format he'd observed from the man on 6, 2 tones that, in the pattern he'd counted, corresponded to an all-clear signal for the adjacent zone. The man at the south end of the junction relaxed his posture fractionally. Just fractionally. But fractionally was enough. What followed was fast and loud enough that he knew the radio was going to spike with responses in about 20 seconds, which gave him a window to get the junction clear and himself into a position that wasn't the middle of a corridor before those responses resolved into people coming to check. He got through the server room door at the 8-minute mark. The terminal running the decryption was still going, Chip. He could see the progress bar, paused at 61% because apparently Chen's second encryption layer was genuinely robust, which he made a note to tell her. He pulled the terminal connection from the server rack, which stopped the decryption attempt, then pulled the rack's external data port covers and broke them. Not elegantly, just physically, with the flashlight handle, so they couldn't be reconnected without tools that weren't in the building. I was at the junction when Victoria, Chen, and Marcus came around the corner at the 9-minute 40 mark. "You look terrible," Victoria said. "Shoulder," he said. "Move." They moved. The route down was the hardest 20 minutes he'd had in a building since a situation in a port facility that he'd never formally reported because the operation it was attached to had never formally occurred. He was running on adrenaline and a bad shoulder and the specific clarity that came from not having any good options, only the least bad ones, chosen fast and committed to fully. He lost the east stairwell on 22 because two of Wolf's team were using it for vertical movement, and he didn't have the angle. He took the group back through the 22nd floor and across to the freight corridor, which added 7 minutes and put him through 2 encounters he handled as quietly as he could manage, which was not quietly enough to avoid Marcus making a sound that Ethan was going to be patient about later when they weren't in a building with people trying to kill them. On 14, Logan Pierce found them. He came through a door in the freight corridor that Ethan hadn't fully cataloged, a secondary maintenance access that wasn't on the building schematic he'd memorized. And for 2 bad seconds, both men assessed each other with the particular loaded stillness of 2 people who each had cause to be uncertain about the other. Logan's hands were empty. His left eye was swelling from something that had connected hard enough to leave a mark. He was breathing controlled, but fast. He looked at Ethan. He looked at Victoria. He looked back at Ethan. "Cross," he said. His voice was flat and tired. "Tell me what you know and tell me fast." Ethan told him the relevant parts in under 2 minutes. Logan listened without interrupting, which was the response of a professional, and his expression during it told Ethan everything he'd needed to know about whether the man was clean. Not what he said, but the way he tracked the information, what landed and what he'd already suspected, and the specific moment his face went hard when Ethan mentioned Craig Fenn's name. "Fenn," Logan said. "I trained him on the access system." "I know." A pause. "He used my credentials." "Yes." Logan stood with that for a moment. The swelling around his eye made his expression harder to read on that side, but the other side was clear enough. "How many left in the building?" "Based on radio traffic, 6, maybe 7. They're running loose formation now. The stairwell encounters disrupted their coverage pattern." Ethan paused. "Their priority is the server room. When they find the terminal disconnected, they're going to shift to extraction mode. They'll want to be out before external response arrives." "Which brings us to the other problem," Logan said. He looked at Victoria. "The fire suppression system has been manually overridden on floors 28 through 35. It took me an hour to figure out what was triggering the alerts because the override was buried in a diagnostic loop." He stopped. "Victoria, there's an incendiary device somewhere in that floor cluster. I haven't found it yet." Ethan was quiet for one long moment. The floor cluster that housed the server room. The same cluster where the decryption attempt had been running. He thought about what Ray had said. Same hardware profile. He thought about the delayed mechanism design. I thought about the elevator, and about a building in a place he wouldn't name, and about the way Damian Wolf had looked at a camera and smiled. "It's in the server room," he said. "Specifically behind the primary rack. Installed before or during the decryption attempt. They needed eyes on when the timer started." He looked at Logan. "Give me the building's emergency override access code. The master system admin code." Logan stared at him. "That code can only be used by— I know what it can only be used by. Give it to me." A pause. Victoria said, "Logan, give it to him." Logan gave it to him. Ethan looked at the number on Logan's phone screen for 3 seconds, memorized it, and handed the phone back. "Get them to the lobby," he said. "All 3 of them. Use the west stairwell. It's been clear for the past 12 minutes. Don't stop on any floor between here and ground." He looked at Marcus. "Stay with Logan. Do exactly what he says." Marcus nodded. He'd stopped looking scared, which wasn't because the situation had improved. It was because there are moments when the fear gets very large and then, paradoxically, goes quiet. Not gone, just underneath everything else. "Ethan." Victoria said his name the way she had in the conference room. quiet, specific, like she was placing it somewhere careful. "I know what the device looks like," he said. "I've seen this exact design before." He held her gaze. "I'll be behind you." She looked at him for a moment with the dark, direct eyes that reminded him, suddenly and incongruously, of Sophie's eyes. The same quality of looking at someone and deciding whether they were telling the truth, and then deciding what to do with the answer. "Don't be late," she said. Then Logan had them moving, and Ethan was already heading back toward the stairs going up. He smelled it before he saw it. Not the incendiary compound itself, but the particular combination of metal and sealed casing that had a smell. If you'd been close enough to these things often enough, which he had. The server room was dark. He used the flashlight on low, moved along the wall, cleared the terminal area, and went to the primary rack. Behind it, attached to the base of the rear panel with the same removable clip system as the HVAC canisters, was a device the size of a hardback book. He crouched in front of it. The display was showing a countdown. He'd been in the building for just under 2 hours. The counter had 41 minutes remaining when he'd entered this room. He knew this because Ray had told him the device signature, and the signature included a 6-hour burn delay from installation, and the installation had happened while the decryption attempt was running, and he'd calculated backward from the terminal's log timestamps. What was on the display now was not 41 minutes. It was 4 minutes and 17 seconds. Someone had remotely accelerated the timer. Ethan stared at the counter for 2 seconds. Not at the device. He'd already cataloged the device. He was looking at the timer, at the gap between what the math said should be there and what was actually there, and the implications of that gap, which were straightforward and not good. Wolf knew he was in the building. Had known, probably, since the junction on 31. Had let him get to the server room and find the device, and then had collapsed the timeline. He wanted Ethan Cross in this room, in front of this device, with not enough time. He wanted him to stand where he'd stood 7 years ago, in that building in the place he wouldn't name, looking at the same architecture, carrying the same weight, and failing the same way. Ethan's hands were on the device casing. His shoulder was a sustained screaming note that he'd filed in a separate compartment. The flashlight threw hard shadows across the rack and the floor and the walls of the room that was supposed to have burned with everything in it. 4 minutes and 2 seconds. He breathed out slowly. Then he started working. The thing about a device designed by someone who assumed you would fail was that it was designed around that assumption. Wolf had built the ambush 7 years ago on the assumption that Ethan would follow procedure, would run standard extraction protocol, would do what a SEAL team did when they encountered a triggered device in a compromised building. And the procedure was correct. It was correct, and it was exactly wrong for what that device was. And 3 men had died because the gap between correct procedure and this specific situation was 6 seconds wide. Ethan was not going to follow the same procedure. He pulled the casing's secondary panel, not the primary. The primary was where the procedure said to look, which was where Wolf had put the layer that defeated the procedure. The secondary panel was where someone went when they'd stopped following the script. The internal layout was exactly what he'd expected and exactly what he'd feared. A redundant trigger system designed so that interrupting the primary circuit completed the secondary. The procedure said, don't touch the primary. Wolf had built a device where the procedure's correct first move was the last move you ever made. But the secondary panel showed him the power distribution. And the power distribution had a gap, a small one, a gap that existed because the redundant trigger needed a microsecond delay to initialize, a delay built in to prevent self-triggering during installation. That delay was the window. 2 minutes and 54 seconds. He took the casing off the power cell with both hands, bad shoulder and all, and worked the distribution bridge with the flashlight handle. Not a tool, not what anyone would have used for this, but available in the right thickness for the gap he needed to create, and held his breath and did the thing that the procedure explicitly said not to do. The countdown stopped. The room was very quiet. 2 minutes and 11 seconds on the display, frozen. Ethan sat back on his heels on the server room floor and put both hands flat on his knees and breathed. Just breathed. For about 15 seconds, he just sat there in the dark with the frozen counter and the smell of metal and the particular silence of a thing that had not happened. Danny, Tomas, Cal. He stayed there with that for those 15 seconds. That was all the time he had, and he used it. Then he stood up, pulled out Logan's override code from memory, and entered it into the building's emergency panel beside the server room door. The building's emergency broadcast system came on with the particular tone of a system that had been waiting to be used. Flat, clear, reaching every speaker on every floor. He didn't say anything into it. He didn't need to. What it did was open a live channel to the building's external monitoring company, which triggered an automatic emergency response protocol, which was already underway before he'd made it back to the stairwell. He went down. On the 9th floor, he passed Craig Fenn, which was not something he'd expected. Fenn was moving fast toward the stairwell, in civilian clothes with a bag over his shoulder, which told him Fenn had gotten a signal from somewhere that the building was burning down and it was time to leave. Fenn saw him and stopped, and for one moment they looked at each other in the 9th floor corridor with the emergency broadcast tone cycling through the speakers above them. Ethan said, "Don't run." Fenn ran. He caught him before the stairwell door. He was not gentle about it, which his shoulder objected to strenuously. He zip-tied Fenn's wrists with a strap from the bag Fenn was carrying, which was both practical and satisfying in a way Ethan didn't examine too closely, and he left him seated against the corridor wall with a clear line of sight to the emergency lighting and the sound of sirens now audible outside the building. "Someone will be here in a few minutes," Ethan said. "Sit still." He went down the last 8 floors. The lobby was lit from outside by the lights of 2 vehicles pulling up to the building entrance. Not police yet, the monitoring company's rapid response team, which was faster and which would have Logan's situation report by now if Logan had done what he said he would do, which he had because Logan Pierce was exactly the man Ethan had eventually concluded he was. Victoria was standing near the security desk when Ethan came through the lobby door. Marcus was beside her, on his phone. Chen was near the entrance, talking to 2 people from the response team. Logan was near the far wall with his arm braced on the desk, talking to someone on his own phone in the clipped tones of a man relaying critical information to someone who needs it fast. Victoria turned when she heard the door. She looked at him. He looked back at her. His shoulder was not something he was thinking about anymore. Or rather, he was thinking about it constantly in the background and had stopped letting it mean anything. "Server room?" she said. "Cleared." He crossed the lobby toward her. "The device is neutralized. The decryption attempt didn't break the second layer." He paused. "You need to tell Chen her encryption work is excellent." Something moved across Victoria's face. Relief, or the front edge of it, the version that comes before you're sure it's real. "You found it in time." "Yes." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said very quietly, so only he could hear it, "Was it the same? The design?" He met her eyes. "Yes." She absorbed that. She didn't look away. "I'm sorry," she said, and it was the same simple version as the conference room. No reaching, no overstatement, just the words, meaning exactly what they said. Outside, the first police units were arriving, their lights crossing the lobby glass in red and blue sweeps. More vehicles behind them, the kind that didn't have lights but moved with a specific urgency that meant federal involvement, which meant Ray had made calls he'd said he was going to make, which Ethan was deeply grateful for. And then, through the lobby glass, stepping out of a dark vehicle with the unhurried movement of a man who had decided the outcome already. Damian Wolfe. He walked toward the building entrance with 2 men flanking him, and he was wearing the face, the one Ethan had described to Victoria. Selected, polished, useful, and there was something in his posture that said he still believed the next 30 seconds were going to go the way he'd planned them. Ethan watched him through the glass. Wolfe saw him. Across the lobby, through the glass, their eyes met. And whatever Wolfe had expected to find in the lobby of a building he'd tried to burn, an empty space, a confused security team, chaos he could step into and redirect. It wasn't this. It wasn't the janitor standing upright in the lobby light, with the CEO of Sterling Defense Systems beside him and a federal response team pulling up at his back. Wolfe's face did something, barely, just at the edges. The thing that happened when a plan met the version of reality it hadn't accounted for. He stopped walking. Ethan watched him stop. Outside, the federal vehicles were emptying. Tactical agents were crossing the parking area in a pattern that had clearly been briefed in advance, which meant Ray's calls had been made hours ago, which meant this had been coming whether the building burned or not. Wolfe looked at Ethan through the glass for one more second. Then he turned and walked back toward his vehicle with the two men flanking him, and the agents were on all three of them before they cleared the curb. Marcus, from somewhere to Ethan's left, said, "Is that him?" Yes, Ethan said. "He doesn't look like what I expected." "They never do," Ethan said. They kept Ethan for 6 hours after the building cleared. Not in the contractor facility this time, in a conference room at a federal field office 3 miles east, with better coffee and worse chairs and a rotating cast of people who introduced themselves with titles that told him less than the way they carried themselves did. 2 from the DoD Inspector General's office. 1 from a federal task force whose exact mandate nobody spelled out clearly. A woman named Farrell, who said she was from a congressional oversight committee and had the particular exhaustion of someone who had been building a case for a long time and was now in the room where it finally mattered. Farrell was the one who did most of the talking. She had a file on the table in front of her that was 3 inches thick, which she opened to specific pages with the practiced ease of someone who had read it enough times to know it by memory, but wanted him to see that the documentation existed. "We've had an active investigation into Black Horizon for 19 months, she said. "The Dallas incident, the Phoenix incident. We tied the hardware signature 14 months ago. What we didn't have was a direct operational link to Wolf's decision-making layer." She paused. "The access logs your associate provided, combined with the physical evidence recovered from the building tonight, gives us that link." "Ray," Ethan said. It wasn't a question. "Mr. Kowalski has been cooperating with our office for approximately 8 months. She looked at him steadily, the way people looked at you when they were delivering information they expected to land hard. "He came to us. He found the federal flag on Black Horizon through his own channels, and he came to us and offered what he knew, which at that point was the connection between Black Horizon's operational signature and your unit's mission 7 years ago." A pause. "He didn't tell you because he was protecting the integrity of an active investigation, and because he thought telling you would put you in motion before we had enough to move." Ethan was quiet for a moment. He thought about Ray's voice on the phone, the careful phrasing. The way he'd said "give me 4 hours" when Ethan had asked him to push false data to Fenn's transmitter. 4 hours that Ray had probably used partly for that, and partly to make phone calls that Ethan hadn't known about. "He was right," Ethan said finally. Farrell looked slightly surprised, like she'd expected more resistance to it. "You're not angry?" "I might be later." He meant it. "Right now I'm trying to figure out what you need from me." What they needed from him took most of the 6 hours. His operational account of the unit's mission, the ambush, the subsequent suppression of the investigation. They needed it in a form that could be entered into a federal record, which meant specific dates and locations and chain-of-command structures that he'd spent 7 years not saying out loud to anyone. Saying them in that conference room with the bad chairs and the rotating cast of people with titles had a quality he hadn't expected. Not relief exactly, but something in the neighborhood of relief's less comfortable cousin. The thing that happened when you put something down that you'd been carrying for so long, you'd stop noticing the weight. He talked about Danny Reese and Thomas Varga and Cal Hutchins, whose names were in Farrell's file on pages he could see from across the table. He talked about the false intelligence, the manufactured target assessment, the man in the chain of command who had signed off on both the mission and the subsequent cover-up. He talked about the conversation he'd been pulled into 4 days after he got home. A windowless room, a man with the kind of authority that didn't need a title attached to it. The specific threat that had been made against the one thing Ethan had left in the world at that point, which was a 3-year-old girl who didn't know any of this was happening. Farrell didn't look away while he talked. She wrote very little, which meant she was listening, and she asked only the questions that clarified rather than the ones that redirected. When he was done, the room was quiet for a moment. "The man who made that threat to you," Farrell said, "he's in the file." I assumed. "He's been cooperating with us since Wolf's arrest tonight. He's attempting to minimize his exposure." She paused. "He will not succeed." Ethan looked at the file on the table. 3 inches of paper that represented, in whatever compressed and documented form these things took, 7 years of 3 families not knowing the full truth about how their sons and brothers and husbands had died. He thought about what it would mean for those families when this became a matter of record. Whether it would help or just add a new layer to something that didn't get better, it just became something you eventually learned to carry differently. He didn't know the answer to that. He doubted anyone did. What happens to the people in my unit's record? He asked. The official record, the one that says what it currently says about why we were discharged. Farrell looked at him. That's being corrected, formally, with whatever designations apply. She paused. It takes time. The bureaucratic process is, it doesn't matter how long it takes, he said. It just matters that it happens. She nodded. It will happen. He believed her, which surprised him slightly. He'd spent 7 years in a world where the official version of things was a construction someone had decided on in advance. Believing an official account was a muscle he'd let atrophy. But Farrell had the specific energy of someone who was angry about the file on her table in a way that was professional and sustained. And sustained professional anger was, in his experience, the most reliable fuel for getting bureaucratic things actually done. They released him at 7:20 in the morning. Ray was waiting in the parking lot. He leaned against a rental car with 2 cups of coffee and the look of a man who had been awake all night and was not going to mention it. He held out one of the cups when Ethan came through the exit. Ethan took it. They stood in the parking lot in the early morning cold without speaking for a moment. 8 months, Ethan said. Yeah. You could have told me. I could have. Ray drank his coffee. He was looking at the middle distance in the way of people who have thought about a decision enough times that they've made peace with it and are no longer interested in defending it. You would have been in motion within 48 hours, and we needed Wolf to make his play before we had everything to take him with. If you'd been in motion, he'd have seen you coming and pulled back. We'd have had the building incidents, but not the financial trail, not the full operational chain. He paused. I needed you where you were. Ethan thought about this. He thought about Sophie's whale emoji and the plastic chair in the classroom and the ham sandwich in the break room and 2.5 years of being nobody in a building where nobody looked at him. I thought about the fact that Ray had known for 8 months and had let him keep mopping floors and being invisible. Was any of it not real? Ethan asked. The janitor job. Did you put me there? Ray looked at him then, directly, which was the tell. The job posting was real. You found it yourself. A pause. I may have made sure you saw it. Ethan drank his coffee. Okay, he said finally. Ray waited. I'm not saying I'm not angry, Ethan said. I'm saying okay as in, I understand the logic, and I know you. He looked at his friend who was older and grayer and had spent 8 months carrying something heavy in silence, which was its own form of the thing they'd both been doing for years. I know you didn't do it easy. Ray was quiet for a moment. No, he said. I didn't. They finished the coffee. Then Ethan got in Ray's rental car, and Ray drove him home. The weeks that followed were not clean. They never were. The version of events in which Damian Wolf was arrested, the evidence was presented, and the correct outcome was delivered swiftly and without complication existed only in the imagination of people who had never watched a federal prosecution build itself from the ground up. What actually happened was, Craig Fenn cooperated immediately and extensively, which was not surprising because Craig Fenn was fundamentally a hired instrument who had no particular loyalty to the man who'd hired him and a significant interest in the portion of his own life that occurred after this. His testimony linked Wolf's decision-making directly to the Black Horizon operational structure, the false intelligence file from 7 years ago, and the financing chain behind both the Dallas and Phoenix incidents. Logan Pierce, once the framing attempt against him was fully documented, became one of the most useful people in the federal case, not because he had direct knowledge of Wolf's operation, but because he had 3 years of meticulous security logs that, when read against the operational timeline, showed exactly when and how Black Horizon's access to Sterling's systems had been established and maintained. Logan was the kind of man who documented everything, which had seemed like a bureaucratic quality and turned out to be an indispensable one. The board member who had been in contact with Wolf's representatives, not Gerald Holt, who was genuinely clean and genuinely furious when he found out, but a quieter member named Stanton who had been receiving what he'd told himself were legitimate consulting fees through a holding company, resigned within 2 days of the arrest and retained a lawyer within the hour after that. The DoD contract evaluation was formally reopened, the suspension lifted. The review committee, once the full scope of Black Horizon's interference was presented to them, moved with a speed that suggested they were as angry about having been played as anyone. None of this happened quickly. None of it happened without complications, reversals, days when the process seemed to have moved backward, and phone calls that Ethan and Victoria and Logan and Farrell's office had with each other that were tense and frustrating and occasionally very close to the edge of what people could professionally absorb. Ethan watched it all from a specific distance because his role in the federal case was as a witness, which meant he had information that mattered and limited ability to do anything about what happened to it. He was not built for that position. He'd spent his professional life being the person who moved, not the person who waited for other people to move. And learning the difference between those two things at age 37 was an education he hadn't asked for and mostly couldn't argue with. Sophie noticed he was home more. She didn't say anything about it directly. She was 7, and the way 7-year-olds process change was by acting like it had always been this way, which was both frustrating and quietly wonderful. She just started leaving her homework on the kitchen table instead of her bedroom, so she could do it in the same room as him. She started asking him to make dinner on nights when it used to be Mrs. Garza's night, which he did, badly at first and improving slightly each time. She told him once during dinner that she'd had to convince him to make because she'd claimed to be tired of cereal. "You make noodles weird." "What does weird mean?" "Like you're trying to do it right and it's making them worse." He looked at the noodles. They were, objectively, a little overcooked. "I'll do better." "You don't have to do better," she said, with the particular precision of someone who has decided to be honest about something. "You just have to stop trying so hard. They're noodles." He laughed. It came out a little rough because he was out of practice with it, or not out of practice. But the laugh caught him before he was ready for it, the way the real ones sometimes did. Sophie looked at him with her mother's eyes and seemed satisfied with this outcome and went back to her dinner. He thought about that for a long time afterward, about the specific gap between trying hard and doing well, and how sometimes the trying was the thing in the way. It was a thing a 7-year-old had told him about noodles, and it applied, he suspected, to approximately everything. Victoria called him 6 weeks after the arrest, on a Tuesday morning, and asked him to come to the building. He drove over. He hadn't been inside since the night in the lobby when Wolf had walked toward the glass and then walked away from it. He'd given his statement to the federal investigators in a conference room elsewhere and done the rest by phone and document. The building had continued being a building. The cleaning service had sent a replacement, someone new, and the floors were presumably being mopped by someone who was only a janitor and didn't know how lucky that was. Victoria met him in the lobby. She was in her work clothes, which made him think of every time he'd seen her in the building. The late nights, the conference room, the small IT office on 32 where they'd stood together, and he'd told her not to be early and not to be late. She looked less exhausted than she had for most of the time he'd known her, which was a low bar that she'd cleared by a significant margin. She looked like someone who had been through something and was on the other side of it. Not unaffected, not smoothed over, but upright and oriented. She'd earned that. He'd watched her earn it. "The contract came through," she said. She said it simply, like a person reporting a fact rather than announcing a victory, which was exactly right. DoD signed the renewal yesterday, $2.4 billion, full evaluation period, with a security audit addendum that, honestly, given everything, we probably would have requested ourselves. "Good," he said. "Gerald Holt apologized to me." She said this with a slightly different quality, something that wasn't quite amusement but was adjacent to it. In writing, which I did not expect, he said he had allowed structural bias to affect his judgment and that he intended to be better. I don't know what to do with that. "Believe it until he shows you otherwise," Ethan said. "That's probably the honest answer." She looked at him for a moment. "That's a very measured answer for someone who spent 6 hours in federal custody on a false espionage charge." "I've had time to work on measured." She almost smiled. Then she said, "I want to offer you a position." He'd been expecting something like this and still wasn't quite ready for the specific weight of it when it came. "Victoria, let me finish." She wasn't asking him to agree, just to hear her out, which he owed her. "Chief Security Officer, full scope, building security, personnel, contract security protocols, the DoD interface on the technical side. Logan stays on as deputy. He wants to..." I asked him and he said he'd rather work under someone who knows what they're doing than be the person who doesn't know what they're doing in the top role. His words. "That's unusually honest for a deputy offer." "Logan is unusually honest." She paused. "The title, the salary, the benefits? I'll send you the specifics. What I want to say in person is this. The company should have known who you were from the beginning. Not because of what you could do for us, though you did plenty, but because someone who pays that much attention to the people around him, who notices the chair moved 3 inches or the camera adjusted 2 degrees, who sat in a break room for 2.5 years protecting a building full of people who didn't know they were being protected. That person deserves to be seen. She held his gaze. I see you, Ethan. The company sees you. This is us asking you to stop being invisible, if you're ready for that. He looked at the lobby around them. The marble floor, the security desk where Marcus sat overnight, the elevator bank where it had started on a Tuesday night that felt, in some ways, like it had happened to a slightly different version of himself. The one who had gotten so good at not being seen that he'd almost convinced himself it was the same as not being there. He thought about the things that visibility cost. The things it had cost already. The investigation, the arrest, the process of having his name attached to events in official documents, which meant Sophie would know eventually. She was 7. She didn't know yet. He was still working out how to tell a 7-year-old that her father had once commanded a team of men and that 3 of them had died, and that he'd spent the years since then trying to live small enough that nothing else could reach him through her. He didn't know how to tell her that. He suspected that what he'd do, when the time came, was start with the whale facts and work up to it gradually, which was probably cowardly and definitely imperfect, and the best he had. I need a condition, he said. Name it. Every person in this building, from the executive floor to whoever replaces me on the overnight cleaning rotation, has a direct reporting line to my office for anything related to security or personal safety. No bureaucratic filter, no chain of command that buries a complaint before it reaches someone who acts on it. He paused. The janitor who notices something wrong has the same access as the board member who does. That's not negotiable. Victoria looked at him. It's not negotiable because you were the janitor. It's not negotiable because the janitor was right, he said. And because in my experience, the people who see the most are usually the ones nobody's bothered to ask. A short silence. Done, she said. I'll have it in the offer letter. They shook hands. His shoulder, which had been taped and then examined by an actual doctor at Ray's insistence, and turned out to have a partial tear that was going to require several months of deliberate management, registered the handshake with a dull protest that he noted and disregarded. One more thing, Victoria said. She reached into the pocket of her blazer and held something out. It was a visitor badge, a temporary one, white with a blue border, the kind they issued to contractors and guests. The name on it was Ethan Cross. Not a title. Not a designation, just his name, in the building where he'd spent 2.5 years being nobody, printed on a badge that said he had a right to be here. He took it. It was a small piece of plastic, and it shouldn't have meant what it did. It meant what it did anyway. The formal restoration of the unit's service record took 4 months from Wolf's arrest. Not because the evidence was insufficient, it was comprehensive by any standard, but because the bureaucratic machinery involved in correcting a classified military record moved with the particular glacial patience of institutions that had spent decades deciding information was safer contained than released. Farrell called when it was done. She said, "It's in the record. Official, permanent, with full honors designations for all 4 members of the unit." 4 members. Ethan, Ray, and the 3 men who weren't there to hear it. Their families? He asked. Have been notified. The families of Reese, Varga, and Hutchins each received a formal communication from the Department of Defense this morning. And a visit. She paused. I want you to know that I personally reviewed the notification process. They were told the full account. Not a managed version, the full account. He was in his apartment when she called. He was sitting at the small kitchen table where he'd sat on the night of the elevator with coffee, looking at nothing in particular. Sophie was at school. The apartment was quiet in the specific way it was quiet on weekday mornings. Not empty, just resting. He thought about Danny Reese's daughter, who would be around Sophie's age now. He'd looked her up once, years ago, and then made himself stop looking, because looking without being able to do anything had a particular quality of futility that he'd chosen to avoid. He thought about whether Danny's daughter would understand, at whatever age she was, what the official correction meant, whether it would matter to her in a concrete way or exist in the category of things adults told her about her father that she was still too young to fully hold. He hoped someone told her that Danny Reese had been good at his job, that he'd been steady and occasionally funny, and had a talent for appearing calm in situations specifically designed to prevent calm, which was rarer than people assumed. He hoped someone told her that, because records didn't capture that. They captured the facts of a person's service, but not the texture of who they were when they were doing it, and texture was most of what a child needed. "Thank you, Farrell," he said. "Thank you," she said. "What you did in that building, the device, the HVAC, the people you got out, there were 46 employees in that building when Wolf's team moved in. You got all 46 out." A pause. "I looked at the security footage, what there was of it. I looked at what you did in that stairwell on the 7th floor. Another pause. "I don't have a file category for it." "That's all right," he said. "It doesn't need a category." After the call ended, he sat for a while longer. He thought about the thing he'd learned. Not in the building, not in the 6 hours at the federal field office, but gradually, over the weeks that followed, in the unspectacular, ordinary space of regular life. He'd spent 7 years believing that the right thing to do was to make himself small, to take up less space, generate less signal, give the people who wanted to reach him through Sophie less surface area to reach. It wasn't cowardice. He'd told himself that many times and mostly believed it. It was a rational strategy for protecting the one thing he couldn't afford to lose. What he hadn't accounted for, because it wasn't something you could account for in advance, was that being invisible had its own costs. Not just to him, to the people around him, who deserved to know who was standing next to them. Marcus, who'd trusted his instincts about the elevator and then trusted him through the building in the dark, had done so with incomplete information about who he was following. Victoria had made decisions in a crisis based on a man whose background she was still partially guessing at. Logan had extended a professional respect that Ethan hadn't fully earned under his actual identity. Visibility was a kind of honesty. He hadn't thought about it that way before. He'd thought about it as exposure, as risk, as the thing that made you a target. And it was all of that. It was also the price of being real to the people around you rather than a function. The thing that happened in the lobby, the good outcome at the end of the stairwell. You couldn't protect people you were invisible to. Not really. You could intervene, you could neutralize threats. But you couldn't be there in the full sense, present, accountable, known, if no one knew who was there. He was still learning that. He suspected he'd be learning it for a while. On a Saturday, 3 weeks after he started at Sterling in his new role, which looked, in the early stages, a lot like rebuilding every security protocol in the building from the access log up, while simultaneously trying to figure out how to manage the paperwork requirements of a senior executive position, which were substantial and not his strong suit, he took Sophie to the aquarium. It was her idea. She'd been asking about it for 2 months with the patient persistence of someone who understood that the answer was eventually going to be yes, and was prepared to wait. He'd kept saying soon, which was a word he'd used too often, and she'd stopped fully believing. And then one Friday evening, she'd sat across from him at the kitchen table and said, "You keep saying soon, and I want to know if soon means Saturday or if it means something else." He'd said Saturday. She'd said, "This Saturday?" He'd said yes. And so on a Saturday in November, with a cold that had come in off the water and made the outside of the aquarium building look bleak and made the inside feel warm. By contrast, Ethan Cross stood in front of a floor-to-ceiling tank of open ocean and watched his daughter press both hands flat against the glass and go completely still. A whale shark moved slowly through the tank above them. Not a blue whale, which Sophie had explained to him carefully was not an aquarium animal, but large enough that the light changed as it passed over them, the tank dimming and then brightening in its wake. Sophie didn't say anything for almost a full minute. This was rare. He stood beside her and let the quiet be what it was. "It's bigger than I thought," she said finally. "Most things are." She turned and looked up at him with the dark, direct eyes. "Is that something you are saying because it's true or because it sounds good?" He thought about it honestly. Both, probably. She considered this. "Okay," she said, and turned back to the tank. He stood beside her while the whale shark made another pass, slow and enormous and entirely indifferent to the small humans watching it from outside the glass. He thought about the years behind him, the mission, the cover-up, the long deliberate erasure, the apartment, the mop, the fluorescent break rooms, and the overnight floors, and the whale emoji at 1 in the morning. He thought about Victoria in the conference room, and Logan in the freight corridor, and Marcus in the corner with his phone, and Ray in the parking lot with 2 cups of coffee and the particular weight of 8 months of silence. He didn't think about Wolf. Wolf was in federal custody awaiting trial, which was exactly where he belonged, and he had taken up enough of Ethan's mental space already. Some people didn't deserve the continued tenancy. What he thought about, standing in front of the tank with Sophie's breath fogging the glass, was what it meant to stop running. Not in the movie version, where stopping running meant everything was resolved and the danger had passed. In the actual version, where stopping running meant choosing, daily, in small and unglamorous ways, to be present in the life you had instead of managing the life you feared. He was bad at that. He'd been bad at it for years. He was cautiously getting better. Sophie's hand was warm when she reached back and found his without looking. The particular confident reach of a child who knows the hand is going to be there. He closed his fingers around hers. "Can we stay for the jellyfish part?" she asked. "Yeah," he said. "We can stay." And so they stayed. An hour, then another. They watched the jellyfish, which Sophie declared eerie in a way she approved of. They watched a sea turtle move through its tank with an ancient, unhurried dignity that Ethan found unexpectedly moving. They ate lunch in the aquarium cafe, where Sophie ordered something she'd never had before and didn't like, and ate most of anyway on principle. Outside, walking back to the car in the cold afternoon, Sophie tucked herself under his arm in the way she'd started doing recently. A new thing, or maybe a return thing, the shape of a small person deciding that the person beside them is a reliable structure to be close to. He put his arm around her shoulders. They walked to the car. He didn't scan the parking lot. He noticed afterward that he hadn't, which was a thing that had never happened before, and he held it carefully, not making too much of it, just noting it the way you noted a first instance of something you hoped would become ordinary. The sky had gone gray over the water. The city moved around them in its usual way, unconcerned, ongoing. Sophie told him 3 facts about whale sharks that he had not known, and that she had apparently been saving for this occasion, delivering them with the timing of someone who had prepared this material and was pleased with the venue for it. He listened to all 3. He was there for all 3. That was enough. That was, in the end, the whole of it. Not the building, not the device stopped at 2 minutes and 11 seconds, not the name restored in the official record. Those things mattered. They'd mattered to people who needed them to matter. But this, the cold parking lot, the gray sky, the arm around his daughter's shoulders, the whale shark facts delivered in sequence. This was what the rest of it had been in service of. The ordinary life, protected. The small mourning that existed because someone had paid attention to an elevator and refused to walk away. He'd spent 7 years being nobody. He thought finally that he might be ready to be someone again.